Now, what I'm going to do is I've been invited, which is wonderful. What a great opportunity for me. And I've been to Prague many times, so this is really a bit of a homecoming because architects really live throughout the world and provide wonderful buildings and new cityscapes of the imagination. So what I'm going to be doing is dealing with some of the work that our office does in London, and our company name is PLP Architecture. And I'm going to start off simply with a project that one of our partners did many years ago. This is River City Prague, and also Danube House, just to the adjacents by the river. So those two projects particularly, and I visited this many times and actually gone into the tunnel works and also all sorts of things that are interesting about the building, particularly its environmental concept. The building looks on to the city, the old city, but also has a relationship to the river. The building appears as a boat with a very strong prow, and of course internally it uses timber, which is one of the discussion points that we're going to have. And it creates a very wonderful space in the center, which is shared among the people that work in the building. There are some very strong environmental ideas having to do with cooling and heating, which you may or may not know about, but if you have a chance to go to the building, you can see where cool air rises and then is extracted at the top. So here we go. This is who we are. Now, one of the buildings that we're very proud of that recently won many awards is called The Edge, somewhat similar to the master plan idea of the Danube House. This is who we are. We're about 200 people, 180, 220 people, variously. And this is an Art Deco building with very strong light that comes in from both sides, very near Tower Hill. You're all invited to visit because we have an open door policy. We love to talk about architecture and also to share ideas. So globally, what is happening in the world today is that we've reached a threshold where more than 50% of the world's population live in cities. We no longer live in country settings. Our humanity will, from here forward, have to deal with problems that cities create in terms of density. So the population will increase significantly by double in city centers, which is unheard of, and there'll be roughly about 40 major cities out of 400 that will really reach a saturation point very quickly. Every 13 seconds is a new person that's created, that's added to the world population. So by the time we're finished this talk, it could be many hundreds or thousands, depending on how long this goes. And then what happens, of course, is that we have a demand for housing, residential properties. This is an interesting diagram because what it's trying to say is really that the global population as it stands presently, about 6.5 to 7.5 billion, many of those will actually end up by 2050 living in cities. So think of the world's population being drawn together as one and then distributed among the 4 major centers of population. So the world will be very vastly different. If there are 70 people here, by 2050 there'd be 140 audience here, all sitting pretty much within the same confines. So our sense of space and our sense of what will be appropriate has to change to accommodate that increase. This is just a slide trying to describe what's going to happen as well. In order to meet the Paris Accords, we're right at the upper diagram where the arrow stops. That's our present situation. To meet the Paris Accord, we actually have to take our present output of CO2 and have it decline. And the only proper way to do that is to create a situation where we start sequestering CO2. We're still going to be producing more. Globally, our population will increase, and these populations will become, to use a poor phrase, westernized. They will start adopting methods of living that we, as a comfortable First Nation, have adopted. And that creates a huge amount of CO2 surplus. So what we're going to have to do is live in a world where we think about how to create negative CO2 as opposed to creating positive. And that, in turn, will allow us to get closer to the zero mark, which we need to get to. So some of these proposals that I'm going to be showing you deal with that issue particularly. So in other words, we have two tracks. We have the track A, which is business as usual, or track B. And it would be preferable for us to have track A, otherwise we would be doubling the amount of CO2 that's being projected by 2035, 2050. For architects, designers, planners particularly, and government officials, the other concern is and the marketplace itself, the other concern is that buildings produce a huge amount of CO2 and a huge amount of emissions in the range of, these are quoted figures, 35% to 47%. So a third of all the CO2 is actually in our bailiwick is the term that's used in the UK, within our domain of responsibility. Now, there are some companies in the world that are taking this seriously. There's a Lend-Lease out of Australia who's working in Chicago and other cities of the world, and they've adopted an approach to try to bring down their building stock so that it can meet these new targets, or at least begin to. A lot of that has to do with upgrading buildings so that they can start to meet that net zero requirement. In Europe, it's essential. So some of these slides I've used throughout the world. In London, there is a damper, in a sense, a barrier towards for floods that come from the sea. And originally, it was just intended to be used 4 times a year when it was first built. But in 2016, within 1 month, it was used roughly 40 times. So the seas are rising. And of course, the calamity is potentially that the seas, the whole of London or portions of it will be inundated. So these kinds of concerns are more relevant to Europeans than they would be to North Americans, say. Only New York really sits on a high flood zone where they are starting to design and build flood-resistant boardwalks. In Europe as well, about 90% of the world's energy comes from harvesting through wind turbines. Elsewhere in the world, they haven't yet caught up. So the world of sustainability is something that is on people's mind, and it's integrated into European culture, which is a good thing. And of course, this is a wonderful idea to create all roads as, photovoltaic cells. The technology of the cells always is advancing. Every 5 years, there's a new technology. You may have heard of a film, and eventually it'll be a paint that could be applied to surfaces to generate solar energy, which is great. The other thing that's changing in Europe, as in elsewhere in the world, is the use of robotics to create and build buildings. And that's going to be essential to our discussion for this building, which is the Oakwood Timber Tower in London, which is the main reason you're here. So robotics are going to be essential to conceiving how this building, made of a kit of parts, modular elements, can be brought together and allowed to be built in a very efficient, optimized fashion that reduces costs and allows us to move forward at a greater pace with the technology. We've been involved, our office has been involved in some of the great buildings of Europe. One of them is the Francis Crick Institute. It's the largest medical facility in the world. And for that, we've won a series of awards. And I mention the awards just so that you know who we are, really, more than anything. This is Sky Central. It's a Sky broadcasting. You can see the use of timber internally, and particularly in the shared space, because we found that timber relaxes people generally. There's a psychological effect to having timber, I guess those are timber ceilings, to having timber surrounding you, because people psychologically, their heart rates drop, they're a little bit more attentive. For school children who have learning difficulties, they concentrate better, and apparently they're a little bit more sociable. So if you can get those kinds of components by the introduction of a material, then you have something that may have a much larger benefit in an urban setting. This is the Edge, which has won a number of sustainability awards. This is in Amsterdam. It's the headquarters of Deloitte. And the notion really is that the central space now is the new office. People share that space, and they use it profoundly in a different way than you would for my generation, certainly. So young people, because of their phones, because of the fact that they have been taught to work together, tend to work together more effectively than they would otherwise. So there's a physical model of it, but again, what's important is the new space that we've created, the atrium. And what's really happened is that people go and work now for Deloitte, not because they want to work for the company, but because they want to work in the building, which is a concept unusual. Not in the building in the typical office space, in the 18-meter bars of office seating, but in this more public space that you can see with its restaurants. And so that's where a lot of the meetings take place. It's highly wired. It's got 30,000 Ethernet cables that drive the light fixtures. And it's one of the great new buildings and prototypes of the world for companies particularly like Google and others. Very much like the building in Prague that you saw, Danube House in Riverside. What we're doing is looking beyond the atrium to the city, the old city. So it's sort of capturing these views and north light. But in this case, the central courtyard is fundamental to the workings of the building in a way that wasn't the case in the previous models. So the building participates as a member of the team. So I'm just going to show you this really quickly.
Welcome to the Edge. This is certifiably the greenest office building in the world. But that just might be the least interesting part about it, because the Edge in Amsterdam is also possibly the most connected office space in the world. Working at the Edge is insane. It all starts with a smartphone app developed by the building's main tenant, the consulting firm Deloitte. When you arrive at the Edge, a camera recognizes you by your license plate for automatic access. And because it's the Netherlands, there are chargers available for electric cars. Inside, things start to get interesting because you don't have a desk. No one here does. Workspaces are assigned to you based on your schedule for the day. You have options. A work booth, a meeting room, what they call a concentration room, a sitting desk, a standing desk, a balcony desk. You can even just hang out in the sun-filled atrium all day. This concept is called hot desking, and it's what allows Deloitte to have 2,500 workers, but less than half as many desks at its Dutch headquarters. The app knows your preferences, and when you arrive at your workspace, the lights dim or brighten based on your stored settings. And any of the building's massive flat screens can be instantly paired with an iPhone or a laptop. So what makes all this possible? The LED light panels developed by Philips specifically for the Edge are actually powered by low-voltage Ethernet cables, which means every light in the building becomes its own internet-connected data hub with 28,000 sensors that makes the building and its users smarter.
The building becomes a very important part of who we are and what we want to be, and we actually seen in recruitment that more people are now spontaneously coming to Deloitte because they want to work in this building.
Oh yeah, and then there's these. The building has solar on the roof and on the south-facing wall, enough to power the building and all of the electric cars, computers, and smartphones used by its employees. And those employees are kept warm by two enormous boreholes tunneling more than 400 feet down beneath the building. During the summer, the Edge pumps warm water deep into the aquifer, where it sits insulated until it can be sucked back out in the winter to warm the building. Outside, there are beehive towers and bat homes to support the local pollinators. and even the rainwater is collected to flush the toilets and irrigate the gardens.
We are planning to build a lot more buildings like these, and the next one will be smarter, and the one after that will be smarter as well. And we won't stop until all cities in the world are filled with buildings that are intelligent and that are not using any energy anymore. In the end, we will actually need less buildings in the world, but the buildings that are there will be used in a better way, will be more efficient, and will be using a lot less energy than in the past.
Sometimes the Edge just feels like it's showing off, and some of the app functionality isn't quite ready for prime time yet. But most of the time, this is all running seamlessly in the background. It's maybe the most fully realized vision of the Internet of Things the world has ever seen. Another day at the Edge comes to an end. A custom security robot that looks a bit like R2-D2 wakes up and begins its patrols. Now, if only the app could automatically come conjure up a nice dinner recipe, maybe provide all the fresh ingredients at the end of the day to get you cooking. No surprise, the Edge has that too. Bon appetit.
So what's interesting about that building is that, in effect, the office building is a center of energy. It's actually creating, through the harvesting of solar power, enough energy to create a surplus that's given back to the grid. What the developer wants to do now is to build a number of buildings in a collection, like a village, so that the energy that's created, the surplus, can then be used by other buildings at certain times of the day, so that they can create basically a solar farm that's integrated fully to the buildings. And that's a unique idea. But I think more profoundly is the notion that the building now serves people instead of people serving the buildings. And that's a pretty profound difference. This has won the Urban Lands Institute Award and a number of other awards. The Breen, which means it's still the world's most sustainable building. It won an AIA award and a number of other awards as well. This goes on to the notion of where the future is going. So we do proposals with other universities and other engineering groups to see whether we can push the envelope of ideas. And now, actually, this is not clicking. So this notion is of a building quite high, so it's conceptual. And the idea is that the structure of the building exists outside, but also the transport. There are basically buses that run around the exterior of the building. So this was a project in Shenzhen, again theoretical, with a company called Tirans, an engineering group. AKT2 is another name for them. But the notion is that we have a mixed-use tower, quite tall, about 1 kilometer in height, and it allows for the structure to be external to the building, and that won an award as well. Now, this is quite adventurous. The notion is that we have a problem in cities, particularly large cities, where traffic congestion causes us not to be able to do the work that we want to do within the 8 hours of our working day. And also, cities have far too few parks and green spaces for people to walk. Healthy living is now being promoted in cities as well by city planners. We want people to walk. We don't want them to stand around and wait for buses. The other idea also is that green space, again, creates a more social setting for workers and people who live in the cities. So as we bring more people into the cities and create denser conditions, we want them to use these beautiful parks and riverfronts in a way that have yet to be devised. So the notion is to take cars that we have now, Teslas and others, and teach them to drive together so that they can move together as one long train and put them not on grade, but put them below grade in very small tunnels, about the size of that door. At that size, the tunneling is very, very cost effective by comparison to much larger tunnels. So the notion, therefore, is to try in the center cities, where there's the most congestion, to create a system of gridiron tunnel works that allow us to go from point A to point B at our leisure. guided by a computer system that knows how the most optimized method at that time to get from A to B, while leaving the ground plane free and moving cars away from people, because we're finding that the death tolls now are becoming quite catastrophic in cities where people are using their mobile phones and driving and people about.